On September 1st, 1860, at exactly midnight, Constance Harper woke to a feeling she had never experienced. The bed was vibrating. Not shaking, vibrating, like the string of a bass fiddle played too low to hear, but strong enough to feel. She woke her husband, Lemuel. He felt it too. She pressed her palm flat against the floor. The vibration was coming from below, not from outside, not from the walls, but from the earth itself. They stood in their nightclothes and listened. There was a sound beneath the vibration, or rather, the vibration was a sound, pitched so low that it registered more as pressure than noise. It had a rhythm, slow, steady, buttum, 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 like something enormous, far underground. Breathing. Lemuel opened the door and looked outside. Across the hollow, lights were appearing in cabin windows. Every family in Harpers Hollow was awake. Every family had felt it. Every family would feel it again tomorrow night. And the night after. And for the next 1,461 nights. Harpers Hollow sat in a crease between two long ridges of the Allegheny Mountains in Greenbrier County, Virginia. A name that would in a few years' time become a name belonging to a different state entirely, though the mountains themselves would not notice the change, and the limestone beneath them would not care. The hollow was perhaps 3/4 of a mile from end to end, narrow enough that a man standing at the center could throw a rock to either ridge without particular effort, wide enough to hold 12 farmsteads set comfortably apart from one another along the banks of a small creek called Harper's Branch, which ran cold and clear out of a limestone spring at the upper end of the hollow and disappeared into a sinkhole at the lower end before re-emerging. Nobody was entirely sure how far downstream, as a tributary of the Greenbrier River. This was the nature of water in this country. It went underground. It traveled in darkness through passages no human had ever seen, and it came back into the light miles away, often warmer or colder than it had been when it vanished, carrying minerals it had gathered from limestone walls in the dark. The people of Harpers Hollow had grown up knowing this about their water. They thought nothing unusual of it. The ground in this part of Virginia was limestone from surface to considerable depth, the same limestone that had been laid down as sediment on the floor of a shallow inland sea 400 million years before, compacted and lithified over unimaginable spans of time, and then slowly dissolved over millions of years more by slightly acidic rainwater filtering downward through fractures and joints and bedding planes. Water is patient in a way that exceeds human comprehension. Given enough time, water will carve a cathedral out of solid rock. Beneath Harpers Hollow and the surrounding ridges, it had been doing precisely that for 20 million years or more, creating a labyrinth of passages, chambers, underground rivers, and vaulted rooms that no living person had ever entered, had no reason to suspect, and would never fully map. The residents of the hollow knew there were caves. You could not live in this country without knowing about caves. 3 of the families in the hollow kept their root vegetables and dairy in shallow cave openings where the temperature stayed constant through summer's heat. Children explored the passages that opened low in the limestone walls of the ridges, venturing perhaps 50 feet into the cool dark before the passage narrowed, or the darkness became too complete, or their mothers called them back to supper. These were the known caves, the manageable caves, the caves that belonged to the human world. What lay 300 feet below them was not manageable and did not belong to the human world. But on the night of September 1st, 1860, it introduced itself. Lemuel Harper was 41 years old, a former schoolteacher who had given up the classroom in his early 30s to work the land his father had left him, and who retained from his teaching years a precise and methodical cast of mind that manifested, in farm life, as unusually detailed record-keeping. He noted the weather in a ledger every morning. He recorded the dates of planting and the yields of harvest. He counted things, bushels, cords of wood, days of frost, miles walked to market, with the quiet compulsion of a man who believed that the world made more sense when its details were written down. On the morning of September 2nd, 1860, before he had eaten breakfast or fed the animals, he took out his ledger and wrote, "Last night at midnight, a vibration rose through the floor of the house. It lasted, by my pocket watch, 47 minutes, and stopped, without diminishing, at approximately 1:47 in the morning." All households in the hollow reported the same experience. The vibration was accompanied by a very low sound, below the range of easy hearing, felt more in the chest and the bones than the ears. Its rhythm was regular, approximately one pulse every 2 seconds. Origin unknown. We'll observe again tonight. Constance Harper, his wife of 20 years, was not a ledger keeper by nature, though she had kept a diary of varying regularity since her girlhood, a practice she had inherited from her own mother, and that she described, when asked about it, as a way of making sure things happened, by which she meant that an experience unrecorded was an experience that might dissolve, might be second-guessed, might lose its edges to the constant work of memory's revision. Constance was 38 years old, black-haired with considerable gray in it, with the kind of plain face that becomes beautiful through the accumulated evidence of a thoughtful life. She had borne 5 children, 3 of whom had survived to adulthood, and she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to contain grief without being consumed by it. She was not mystical by inclination. She had no patience for the fortune-tellers who sometimes came through the hollows, no interest in portents or prophecies, but she was attentive. She noticed things. On the morning of September 2nd, after Lemuel had gone to his ledger, she wrote in her diary, "I am not afraid of it. That is the first thing I want to say, because I think in years to come I may want to know whether I was afraid. I was not. I was something else. Awake. In a way, I am not usually awake. The whole house was different while it lasted. Not wrong, just more present, somehow, as if the walls had become aware of themselves. Lemuel is already measuring it. That is right and proper. But I think measuring it is only one kind of knowing. The sound, they had no name for it yet, continued on the second night, and the third, and by the fourth night the community had begun to gather, in the way that communities have always gathered when they have found something too large and strange to keep to themselves. They met in the churchyard of the small Methodist church that stood near the center of the hollow, presided over by Reverend Eli Whiting. It was a Sunday, which seemed appropriate to Whiting and did not seem anything in particular to those who were not in the habit of finding significance in the days of the week. Reverend Whiting was a tall, thin man of 55, with the kind of earnest face that has never quite grown comfortable with its own sincerity. He had been the minister of Harpers Hollow's small congregation for 11 years, arriving from the Shenandoah Valley, after a brief and unhappy stint at a larger church in Staunton where his sermons had been found, by his superiors, to be somewhat too personal, too full of specific human suffering, and not enough of doctrinal architecture. In Harpers Hollow, he had found his proper scale. He knew every family. He had baptized their children and buried their parents, and sat with their dying, and listened to their failures with the particular quality of pastoral attention that does not judge, but does not pretend either. He was, in the truest sense of an often misused word, a good man. And he had heard the sound, and he had pressed his hands together in the dark while it pulsed through the floor of his small house. And he had felt, he would say this to the congregation, publicly, without embarrassment, that something was being communicated to him, not in words, not in visions, but in the particular way that a man of faith sometimes knows a thing before he can name it. I believe, he said that Sunday morning, standing before the gathered families in the September light, that we are being called to attention. The ground beneath us is not merely ground, it is witness. He paused. He looked at the faces looking back at him, the women with their aprons and their tired eyes, the men with their hats in their hands, the children ranged at the edges of the group with the restless energy of children who cannot understand why adults stand still. We live, all of us, on borrowed time and borrowed land. The nation, I say this with sorrow, not with politics, but I will say it plainly. The nation is dividing itself, and the ground is speaking. I do not know what it is saying. I know only that it is speaking, and we would be fools not to listen. There was a silence after this that was not entirely comfortable. Then Colonel Danton Arbogast cleared his throat. Arbogast was a man who had earned his rank in the Mexican War, and worn it since with the particular possessiveness of men who have risked their lives for a title. He was 60 years old, heavy-set, with white hair, and the kind of ruddy complexion that comes from a lifetime of outdoor work, and a fondness for whiskey that he considered a private virtue. He owned the largest farm in the Hollow, 300 acres, a working mill on the creek, 4 hired hands, and he carried himself with the comfortable authority of a man accustomed to being the largest economic fact in any room he entered. He had lived above these caves all his life, as had his father before him, as had his grandfather before that, and in 60 years he had never felt the ground do anything unusual beneath his feet, which, in his understanding of the world, was evidence that the ground had nothing unusual to do. It is the caves, he said, without particular urgency, as a man states a settled thing. You all know we're sitting above cave country. Water moves through limestone. Sometimes the passages shift. Sometimes you get a little noise. I've heard it before, years ago. Not as regular as this, but similar. It means nothing except that it's wet down there and water is moving the way water moves. He looked at Reverend Whiting with the particular expression of a practical man tolerating a spiritual man's excess. With respect, Eli, the Lord has more efficient methods of communication than rattling people's floorboards. This is geology. Granny Skaggs, who had not moved from her place at the edge of the gathering and who had not yet spoken, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Prudence Skaggs was 73 years old and had lived in Harpers. Her entire life, She had been born in the same house she still occupied, a house her father had built in 1790 on a slight rise at the upper end of the hollow, where a spring came out of the limestone and ran clear and cold through her garden. And she had learned the particular knowledge of old women in mountain hollows, which is a knowledge of plants and soil and weather and the long, slow behavior of the land that is not mysticism, but is not entirely science either, and tends to be right more often than either mystics or scientists find comfortable. She had delivered half the current residents of Harpers Hollow. She knew the names of every plant that grew on both ridges. She had watched sinkholes open in the fields after wet springs, and watched springs move, in dry years, 100 feet from where they had been the year before. She had felt the land breathing for 70 years, and she was not surprised that now, in its own time, for its own reasons, it had raised its voice. "Danton is right that it's the caves," she said, in a voice that carried more easily than a voice of her age had any right to. "That part's not in question. But what he's not saying is that the caves don't usually do this, and when they start doing something new, it generally means something has changed down there. The passages shift. Rock falls. Sometimes it means the hollow above gets quiet. Sometimes it means a sinkhole opens in your cornfield. Sometimes it means the spring moves, and then your well goes dry." She looked around the group with clear, dark eyes that missed nothing. "I'm not saying the Lord is talking. I'm not saying it's nothing. I'm saying the ground has changed, and when the ground changes, you pay attention to whether the change is getting better or getting worse." She paused, and then added, in a quieter tone that still carried, "I have lived here my whole life. My mother lived here, her whole life. 3 times, when I was young, I heard talk from the older people about sinkholes that opened in the hollow. Once in a field, twice near the creek. The creek moved itself one spring overnight, 6 feet to the east. The ground does what it likes. We are guests here. I think we should remember that." No one argued with Granny Skaggs, not because she was old or because she was respected, but because there was in her manner of speaking a quality of simple accuracy that made argument feel like stupidity. It was young Calvin Harper who spoke last, and only to himself, or nearly. He was standing at the far edge of the group with 2 other boys his age, all 3 of them taller than they'd been the previous spring, their voices newly unreliable, their attention simultaneously restless and intense in the way of 17-year-old males. He had pressed both palms flat against the ground during the sound the night before, lying on the floor of his parents' house, and he had felt it vibrate up his wrists and into his arms and through his ribs and into his sternum. He had stayed there for the full 47 minutes, and when it stopped, he had continued to lie there for a long time, feeling the absence of it, feeling the ordinary inert silence of the ground beneath him. When Granny Skaggs finished speaking, Calvin said, half under his breath, not quite to anyone, "It feels like the mountain's alive." The 2 boys beside him looked at him. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked like a young man who has said the true thing before he's thought about whether it's wise. In the weeks that followed, the community's relationship with the sound organized itself into the positions that had been staked out at that first meeting. Reverend Whiting built his interpretation slowly and carefully, Sunday by Sunday, weaving the heartbeat. The community had begun calling it that, though no one remembered who had used the word first. It had simply arrived, the way necessary words do, and attached itself to the phenomenon before anyone could propose an alternative. Into his ongoing sermons about the state of the nation and the state of the soul. He was careful to be non-political, or to believe he was being non-political. Though in 1860 in Virginia, it was becoming increasingly difficult to say anything about the state of the nation without the politics coming through. He spoke about warning. He spoke about the still, small voice. He did not say what God was warning about, which was both theologically prudent and somewhat maddening to his congregation. Arbogast maintained his geological interpretation with increasing confidence, which was not the same thing as increasing certainty. The truth was that the regularity of the sound bothered him. 47 minutes every night, starting at midnight, with a precision that exceeded anything he associated with the random movements of underground water. Water was not a timekeeper. Water did not have a schedule. He said nothing about this. He continued to say it was the cave settling, that everyone should ignore it and go about their business. And he continued to lie awake on his own between midnight and 1:47 in the morning, listening to it pulse through his stone foundation and trying to feel less disquieted than he felt. Lemuel Harper recorded it. Every night he noted the time of onset, the duration, the apparent intensity, which he measured by placing a glass of water on the kitchen floor and observing the size of the concentric ripples that appeared during the vibration. He developed a rough scale. Small ripples in still water, medium ripples, large ripples, very large ripples that occasionally splashed slightly at the rim of the glass. The ripples were always in the medium to large range. He noted whether the vibration was stronger or weaker in different rooms. It was stronger in the back room, which had a stone floor laid directly on the earth, and slightly weaker in the front room, which had wood plank flooring over a small air gap. He noted the temperature on the nights he recorded, the wind direction, whether it had rained. He was looking for correlation, for some environmental variable that might explain the sound's onset. He found none. The sound came in rain and in drought, in cold and in warmth, in wind and in dead calm. It came when the creek was high and when it was low. It began at midnight and stopped 47 minutes later and did not appear to care about anything above the ground. The dogs of Harpers Hollow had the most visceral response to the sound. They did not howl through it, as dogs sometimes do during thunderstorms or other disturbances. Instead, they went quiet. Not merely quiet, but silent in a way that had something of dread in it, pressing themselves against the walls of porches or crawling under beds, with their ears flat and their eyes showing white around the edges. In the morning, they emerged and went about their usual business without apparent memory of the night's terror. But as the days shortened into October and the sound became established as a nightly event, the dogs began to go underground, crawling under porches and foundations in the hour before midnight, as if they knew what was coming and had made peace with the fact that the best response was concealment. The chickens refused to roost in the hen houses, preferring the trees, which their owners found inconvenient but could not argue with. The horses in their stalls stamped continuously through the 47 minutes, not panicked but deeply uncomfortable, shifting their weight from hoof to hoof, with the restlessness of animals who know something is wrong but cannot identify or escape it. In the second week of September, Constance wrote, "It is the regularity that stays with me. Any frightening thing, if it is irregular, can be managed. You brace for it, it passes, you recover, you wait. But this comes every night at the same time and lasts the same length and stops the same way, clean as a door closing. Lemuel says this is what tells him it is mechanical, that natural systems are usually irregular, and regular things have regular causes. But the regularity to me feels less like machinery and more like intention. I do not know what would intend such a thing. I am not sure I believe anything intends it. I only know that regularity implies will. Somehow, to the feeling mind, even when the reasoning mind says otherwise. She was a better prose stylist than she gave herself credit for, Constance Harper. She had no formal education beyond what the daughters of farming families in the Virginia mountains received in those years. Reading, writing, arithmetic, scripture, the practical arts. But she had read widely in what came her way, and she had the gift, which is not taught but is sometimes developed by those who practice the habit of close observation, of saying the true thing in the simplest way. Her diary would eventually contain more than 300 entries about the heartbeat over 4 years, and those entries would constitute, without her knowing it, the most detailed first-hand account of the phenomenon that would ever exist. The sound itself. It is worth attempting a more precise description because it was genuinely unusual in ways that the word vibration fails to fully convey. At its most basic, it was infrasonic. Its fundamental frequency was approximately 12 to 15 cycles per second, below the 20-cycle threshold of normal human hearing, but well within the range at which the body begins to feel sound as physical pressure rather than perceiving it as audio information. This is the frequency range of distant thunder, of the lowest pedal notes of a pipe organ, of the infrasound generated by large storms and, occasionally, by geological events. Animals are sensitive to it in ways that humans are not. This accounts for the behavior of the dogs and horses, who were receiving information about the sound that their owners were not receiving in the same way. Humans experience infrasound as unease, sometimes as a sense of presence, sometimes as a vague dread that has no identifiable object. People in rooms with infrasound often report feeling that they are not alone. Scientists who have studied the phenomenon in laboratory settings have noted that infrasound at certain frequencies triggers the eye's peripheral vision to produce faint visual anomalies, which may explain some percentage of ghost sightings in old buildings with drafty pipes and resonant chambers. But the heartbeat had a quality beyond mere infrasound. It was rhythmic, 2 pulses per cycle, each cycle lasting approximately 2 seconds, a slow and stately meter that the human nervous system immediately patterns as cardiac. The heart, the foot, the breath, the pendulum, the rocking chair, the ocean wave. The pattern-seeking mind, encountering anything that pulses in regular time, reaches for its oldest and most intimate reference point, which is the heartbeat, which is the first sound any human being ever hears, pressed against the interior wall of a mother's womb. The residents of Harpers Hollow were not imagining a heartbeat in the sound. They were perceiving one. The word they chose was not poetry. It was description. Beneath the community, and they did not know this, and would not know it for 3 more years, the limestone lay in horizontal beds, tilted slightly east, 300 feet of it above the level of the underground river, fractured throughout by the innumerable joints and planes along which rock splits when subjected to the slow pressures of tectonic time. Water had been moving through those fractures since before the mountains above them had achieved their current height. Water dissolving limestone molecule by molecule, carrying it in solution toward the larger passages, depositing it again in the form of the flowstone and dripstone formations that decorated the cave chambers below. The underground river that ran beneath the hollow was not a river in the surface sense, not a channel of clear water moving between recognizable banks, but a series of connected pools and passages and sumps, some of them partly air-filled, some completely submerged, some flowing swiftly through narrow canyons, and some spreading wide and shallow across floored chambers half a mile across. The river had a name in the surface world. Harper's Branch was its upstream expression. The spring at the upper end of the hollow, its upwelling point. But the name did not capture what the river was underground, which was something old enough and complex enough and indifferent enough that naming it was a presumption bordering on absurdity. 300 feet below the kitchen floor of Constance Harper's house, the river entered a chamber that would have made an explorer who had never seen it stop and stand very still and breathe carefully and try to understand what their eyes were seeing. The chamber was large, perhaps 200 feet across and 70 feet from floor to ceiling, with walls of white and amber limestone draped in curtains of flowstone that had been depositing for 100,000 years, and in whose formations you could read, if you knew how to read it, the record of ice ages and warm periods and droughts and floods, each one leaving its chemical signature in the stone. The ceiling was domed, and its acoustics were, as a result, extraordinary, a property that the chamber had possessed for millennia, and that no one had ever been in a position to appreciate. The river entered the chamber from the northeast through a low archway at water level, flowed across the chamber's floor, and exited through a smaller passage to the southwest. Partway through the chamber, the floor dropped sharply, a fault scarp, a vertical displacement of perhaps 20 feet. And the river fell over this drop and into a pool, and from the pool it flowed into the southwestern exit passage. This passage, this exit, about 4 feet wide and 3 feet high at its mouth, tapering as it went, was the mechanism. 60 feet from the chamber, the passage curved downward, dipping below the local water table, and the water that ran through it was, for a stretch of perhaps 200 feet, completely submerged. This was a siphon, a passage full of water, sealed at both ends by air pockets, requiring positive pressure to move the water through it. Water from the chamber above built up behind the siphon's entrance point, rose until it reached a certain level, and then was pressed through the submerged passage in a surge, a rapid, forceful discharge that dropped the level in the chamber rapidly before it built again. Fill, surge, drain, fill, surge, drain. The surges were not violent in a human sense, but they were significant in a hydraulic sense. Perhaps 2,000 gallons moving rapidly through a confined space in the space of a few seconds, and the hydraulic shock of each surge, transmitted upward through the water-saturated limestone, arrived at the surface as the two-beat pulse of the heartbeat. A rockfall had changed this in the final days of August 1860. A section of the upstream passage, where the river entered the chamber from the northeast, had collapsed. A ceiling section of perhaps 10 cubic feet of limestone, loosened by centuries of slow dissolution, giving way at last and dropping into the passage below. The collapse had partially blocked the inlet, creating a constriction that changed the flow dynamics of the whole system. The siphon, which had previously drained steadily and continuously, now drained in discrete pulses. And the changed geometry of the inlet had created a resonance, a standing wave in the chamber that had not previously existed, and that amplified the siphon's pulse into the infrasonic heartbeat that was shaking the floorboards of 12 farmhouses 300 feet above. None of this was known in September 1860. What was known was that the sound came every night and lasted 47 minutes and had a rhythm. The community adapted as communities do, not by solving it, but by incorporating it. They learned to sleep through it, most of them, or to lie awake through it without distress, or to use the 47 minutes as a kind of enforced wakefulness in which they could think or pray or listen to the night. Lemuel continued his measurements. Constance continued her diary. Reverend Whiting continued his increasingly urgent sermons about attention and warning. Arbogast continued his dismissals, though they were becoming less curt and more elaborate, which is what happens when a dismissal begins to require effort to maintain. By October, the Hollow had taken on the particular quality of a place that has become conscious of itself, a community that has always existed in its landscape, and now cannot stop noticing the landscape existing back. The trees above the ridges turned in the autumn way of Allegheny ridgelines, sudden and total and startlingly beautiful, the oaks going bronze and the maples going the deep red that looks almost black in certain lights, the yellow of hickory and the brief orange of sourwood against the gray limestone walls of the ridges. The heartbeat had been with them for 2 months now. It had become part of the season, part of the place, as much as the smell of wood smoke or the taste of the first hard cider from Arbogast's mill, or the particular sound of geese moving through the hollow at night, headed somewhere south. Calvin Harper, lying on his back on a cold October night and pressing his hands flat against the frost-hardened ground, listening to the badum, pulse, rise through his palms and his forearms and into his chest, said nothing out loud about what he was thinking. He was thinking about the ground beneath him as something alive, not in a way he could have explained to his father or to Reverend Whiting or to anyone who would have wanted an explanation. He was thinking about what it meant to belong to a place that had a pulse, and out in the world beyond the hollow, beyond the ridges, beyond the mountains that had defined the western edge of Virginia for 200 years of European settlement, the larger story was gathering itself. The election was 6 weeks away. The country was a loaded weapon, being carried by people who disagreed about which direction to point it, and the newspapers that came to Greenbrier County via the post roads were full of language that sounded less like political argument and more like the kind of language people use when they have already decided what they are going to do and are searching for words that make it sound like something other than what it is. In the hollow, people argued about what the heartbeat meant. In the capitals, people argued about what the Union meant, and those arguments were headed toward the same place that all arguments head when they can no longer be resolved by words. The sound went on. 47 minutes. Every night. Ba-dum. 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 Below the frost in the root cellars and the stone foundations, below the water table and the shallow caves and the fractured limestone, The underground river filled its chamber and pushed its water through its siphon and sent its pulse upward through 300 feet of ancient rock, indifferent to the autumn above and to the winter that was coming, and to the larger catastrophe that was assembling itself on the far side of the mountains. The surveyor arrived in January 1861. A man named Jonas Prewitt, out of Louisburg, employed by a land grant office to resurvey the property lines of a disputed estate on the far side of the ridge. He stopped in the hollow for the night because his horse had thrown a shoe and the cold had come on hard, and because Constance Harper kept a clean house and had a reputation for good bread. He was a practical man of measurements. He owned a transit and a chain and a set of drawing instruments, and believed in the reducibility of all physical facts to numbers on a page. He had no patience for strangeness. He had been in the business of strangeness, he would have said. Precisely 0 years. He woke at midnight to the heartbeat. The Harpers found him in the morning sitting at the kitchen table with his coat on and his surveying bag open before him. And when Constance put bread and coffee in front of him, he ate without speaking for a while, and then said without looking up, "How long has it been doing that?" "Since September," Lemuel said. "Every night?" "Every night." Prewitt nodded slowly, as if this answered a question he hadn't asked. Then he said, "I'd like to use your floor for an hour this morning, if you'll permit it." What he did, while Lemuel watched and Constance recorded in her diary, was set up a plumb line. A string, weighted with a lead bob, hung from a nail he tapped gently into the kitchen door frame, and left it hanging perfectly still in the still air of the room. He noted the position of the bob carefully. He did not ask about the sound. He did not theorize. He just set up his instrument and told them he would be back at midnight and asked if he could stay another night. At midnight, with the vibration rising through the floor and the bay-dumb pulse filling the room with its felt pressure, Prewitt crouched beside his plumb line with a lantern and a magnifying lens and watched. The bob was moving. Not much, perhaps a 1/16 of an inch of swing. Rhythmic, tiny, absolutely regular. He watched it for the full 47 minutes. When it stopped, he stood up, put his lens in his pocket, and wrote one line in his surveying book. He would not show them what he wrote. He thanked them for the hospitality, settled up what he owed, and left the next morning. But Constance had seen, when he held the book at a certain angle, enough to make out a few words. She wrote them in her diary later that day. Confirmed, measurable vibration, periodic, origin below grade. The community felt something like vindication at the news of the plumb line, though it had confirmed only what they already knew, which was that the thing was real and not imagined. Arbogast, told about it by Lemuel at the mill that week, said, "Of course it's real. I've never said it wasn't real. I said it was meaningless." But his saying of it had a different quality now. Less certainty, more effort. The winter was hard and long, as winters in Greenbrier County often were, with snow that came in early December and stayed in the shaded hollows until late March. The heartbeat continued through the snow and the cold and the gray days when the whole hollow felt sealed under cloud and the ridges disappeared in weather. In some ways, winter made it more noticeable. The cold and the quiet amplified everything. And in the deep still of a January night, the ba-dum pulse resonating through frozen ground had a clarity that the autumn had not offered. Constance wrote, "In summer, there is so much noise, frogs, insects, the creak high and loud, that you hear the heartbeat against a background of the world's regular sounds. In winter, the world is quiet and the heartbeat is louder, not because it has grown, but because everything else has diminished. I wonder sometimes if that is what winter is for. She was, increasingly, doing two things with her diary: recording the physical facts of the sound and thinking about what it meant to have this sound in their lives. She was careful to separate these, to label one the thing itself, and the other what I make of it. She distrusted the conflation of observation and interpretation, even in a private journal. But she was increasingly interested in the second category, the making of meaning, because she was increasingly aware that meaning was what the community was actually arguing about, and that the argument was not really about the sound. The sound was a screen on which they were projecting other things. She did not know yet what those other things were. She would come to know in time, in the way that people know things they have been circling for years, suddenly, and with the quality of recognition rather than discovery. April 1861 arrived, and with it, Fort Sumter. The news took 5 days to reach Harpers Hollow by way of a rider who had come from Lewisburg, who had heard it from a man who had been in Staunton, where the telegraph had brought it. The rider, a young man named Amos, whose family name no one could later recall, arrived on a Thursday afternoon and tied his horse in front of Arbogast's store and said, loudly enough for the 3 men on the porch to hear, that the Confederates had fired on Fort Sumter, and that the garrison had surrendered, and that it appeared there was going to be a war. The 3 men on the porch were silent for a moment. Then one of them said, "Well," and there was nothing more to say that afternoon, because the sentence that would capture what was happening in the country was not a sentence anyone in Harpers Hollow had the words for yet. It was a sentence that would take 4 years and 600,000 deaths to write. What happened to the Hollow in the months after Fort Sumter was not sudden and dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic, which is to say, it was slow and incremental and quiet and carried out in small gestures and avoided looks and conversations that stopped when a certain name came up. Virginia voted to secede in May. The western counties of Virginia, the mountain counties, the counties where few people owned slaves, and where the industrial interests that bound the tidewater to the Confederacy had never had much purchase, reacted with varying degrees of opposition. In Greenbrier County, which was a border county in every meaningful sense, the split was real and locally painful. The Arbogast family and their circle, the more prosperous landowners, the families with ties to the Tidewater establishment, went with Virginia, went with the Confederacy. The Harper and Skaggs families, the middling farmers, the people who had come from Pennsylvania German stock 2 generations back, who thought of themselves as Virginians but thought of themselves as Americans first, did not. The argument about the heartbeat began to map precisely onto these positions, which Constance noticed and found both obvious and sad. Those who had aligned with the Confederate cause began speaking about the sound the way Arbogast had always spoken about it, dismissively, impatiently, as evidence of a certain kind of credulity or weakness, the kind of weakness that reads meaning into meaningless things. Those who had aligned with the Union began speaking about it the way Reverend Whiting had spoken about it in September. as a warning, a sign, a communication from something larger than human politics. Neither side was interested in the sound itself. They were interested in what their interpretation of the sound said about them. Reverend Whiting complicated this picture considerably. He had spent the winter and early spring of 1861 developing a theological interpretation of the heartbeat that was, in its way, coherent and even beautiful. The land itself in mourning for a nation that was failing its foundational promise. The earth grieving what the people could not see clearly enough to grieve. It was the kind of interpretation that required the nation's tragedy to be real and legible, required a God who was interested in American political history, required the minister to have access to divine intention. Whiting believed all of these things, or had believed them in September, and his sermons through the winter had built, carefully and earnestly, a vision of the heartbeat as prophetic. Then, in June 1861, a Confederate recruiting officer named Captain Beauchamp came to Greenbrier County with a commission to organize a company of volunteers, and he stayed in Harpers Hollow for 3 days, and he spoke with Reverend Whiting privately for several hours, and he made a promise about a new church, a proper church, not the current small building, but a real church with a real steeple on a proper lot in Lewisburg that would be built with funds from the Confederate government's patronage of loyal ministers in the Virginia mountains. After Beauchamp left, Whiting's sermons changed, not dramatically, not in a single Sunday's reversal that would have been too obvious and would have cost him his congregation's respect immediately. But gradually, over the following months, the heartbeat was mentioned less and less in his sermons, and when it was mentioned, it was in different terms, not warning, not prophetic sign, but natural phenomenon, perhaps, as Colonel Arbogast had always said, merely the sound of underground water. Whiting never said directly that he had been wrong. He simply stopped saying he had been right, and in the valley between those two positions, the implication found its own level. Constance wrote about this without rancor and without particular surprise. She was not a cynical woman, but she had lived long enough to know that interpretation follows interest more reliably than it follows evidence. She did not condemn Whiting. She understood him. She wrote, "He is not a wicked man. He is a man who wants a real church. I cannot say, if I were in his position, that I would do differently. But I note that the Lord seems to have changed his message, and I think the Lord is not the one who changed." The summer of 1861 was the last summer in which anything in the Hollow felt ordinary. Men were drilling in the county seat. Roads that had carried only farm wagons and post riders now carried military supply wagons and occasional units of soldiers, Confederate or Union, depending on the month and the direction of the most recent engagement. The Shenandoah Valley, to the east, was already a theater of war. The mountains still felt remote from it, but remote is not impervious, and the remoteness of the Alleghenies was eroding week by week. Calvin Harper turned 18 in October 1861. He had, in the year since the heartbeat began, grown 4 inches and developed the kind of physical seriousness, the weight and intentionality of movement, that comes to young men in the months just before they make an irreversible decision. He had been listening to the discussions in the Hollow, and in the county seat, and in the church, and he had reached a conclusion that was less political than visceral. The land was alive. He believed this genuinely and not as a figure of speech, and the question of whose vision of the land would prevail. The vision in which it was a thing to be possessed and worked by a few people and their captive labor, or the vision in which it was a thing that belonged in some complex way to whoever worked it and lived above its heartbeat, was a question he was willing to fight for. He did not think about it in those terms, exactly. He thought about it in the terms available to an 18-year-old farmer's son in 1861, which were terms of honor and loyalty, and the particular kind of love for a place that makes a young person believe the place would love them back. He told his parents in November. His father received the news with the stillness of a man who had known it was coming and had been trying to decide how to feel about it and had not yet succeeded. His mother received it with the stillness of a woman who had also known and had already been feeling all the things there were to feel about it, and had arrived at a place that was not acceptance exactly, but was something past the worst of the grief. The last night Calvin slept in the house. He and Lemuel sat on the porch after supper, after the women had gone inside, and waited. They didn't talk much. When midnight came, the heartbeat rose through the boards of the porch floor, and the two of them sat in it for the 47 minutes without speaking. Calvin had his palms flat on his thighs, feeling it. Lemuel had his hands around a cooling cup of coffee. When it stopped, they sat in the silence for a while, and then Lemuel said, without looking at his son, "You'll write." "I'll write," Calvin said, and in the morning he was gone. The winter of 1861 to 62 had a quality that Constance struggled to describe, and eventually described as hollow, a word she immediately recognized as unfortunate given where they lived, but she let it stand because it was accurate. The hollow felt hollowed. Half the men of the community were gone. Calvin, two of the Skaggs boys, the three oldest Whiting sons who had gone Confederate against their father's complicated private wishes, two hired hands from the Arbogast farm. What remained was women and old men and children, and the particular industry of people who have a great deal of work to do and no one to help them do it, which is not entirely different from ordinary life, but has a different quality to it, heavier and more purposeful, and without the lightness that comes from having people around who might, at any moment, make you laugh. They managed. Mountain women had always managed, which is not a compliment to the difficulty of their situation, so much as a statement of fact about their competence. Constance and the three women whose men were with the Union, she does not name them all in her diary, protecting their privacy even in a private document, organized themselves with the efficiency of people who understand interdependence as a survival strategy. They shared labor. They shared food in the lean months. They shared information about where Confederate foragers had been seen, because Confederate foragers had begun appearing in the county, requisitioning horses and food from civilian farms for the Confederate supply lines, and the women of Harpers Hollow were not inclined to give their horses and food to an army their husbands were fighting against. The Battle of Louisburg came in May 1862. The details of it, the Union forces under Colonel George Crook pushing south from the Kanawha Valley, the Confederate forces under Colonel Henry Heth defending Louisburg, the engagement that lasted most of the morning before the Confederates were routed, are part of the formal history of the war. What is not in the formal history is the sound of it in Harpers Hollow. The hollow was 18 miles from Lewisburg in a straight line, and the Allegheny ridges were between them, and artillery carries through mountain geography in particular ways, echoing and multiplying in the valleys, so that what arrived in the hollow was not the sharp crack of individual guns, but a low, continuous, rolling percussion that built and built through the morning hours and then gradually diminished through the afternoon. It was not unlike thunder. It was exactly unlike thunder. Everyone knew what it was. The women stood outside the cabin doors and listened to it. Some of them knew, or believed, or feared that someone they loved might be among the soldiers making that sound, firing or being fired at, living or dying in the 20-mile distance. There was nothing to do with this knowledge, except hold it. Constance stood in the doorway of her house and listened, and she wrote about it that evening. I stood there and listened to the guns and tried to find Calvin in the sound, which I know is absurd, but which I could not help doing. I could not find him. The guns were not individual. They were one long, rolling voice that said nothing, except that it was happening, and we were not there, and the only thing we could do was stand here and hear it. And then at noon, the guns fell off, and the day went quiet, and I went inside and made bread. And at midnight, the heartbeat came as it always does, and I was glad of it. That's what I want to record, that I was glad. She wrote more about this later, returning to the juxtaposition in multiple diary entries through that summer. The guns were irregular, unpredictable, capable of beginning at any moment and ending at any moment, signifying specific human events of terrible consequence. The heartbeat was regular, predictable, incapable of surprise, signifying nothing. And the nothing of it had become, over 20 months of living with it, a kind of comfort that she would not have predicted and could not entirely explain. It was not a positive thing, this comfort. She was careful to say it was not a positive thing. It was not like the comfort of a fire or a meal or a letter from your son. It was the comfort of reliable sameness, of a feature of the world that did not change when everything else was changing, that had no relationship to the war or to the suffering, and did not mourn and did not threaten and did not mean anything. The war takes everything, she wrote in August 1862. The sound gives nothing. But it is the same every night, and there is something in that. They had begun, without making a decision to do so, to time their lives by the heartbeat the way other communities timed their lives by church bells or the position of the sun. Going to bed before midnight was standard practice now, not because the sound kept anyone awake, since most of them had learned to sleep through it, but because the act of lying down before the sound began had become a ritual, a proper ordering of the night. The sound was the last thing before sleep, or it was the signal that sleep was over, and the night was in its deep middle, and you might as well accept that you were awake for now. Women who needed to do night work, baking for the morning, tending a sick child, writing a letter, would note the onset of the sound as a kind of marker. It's past midnight. The sound is on. I have 47 minutes. They arranged candles and lamp oil accordingly. The heartbeat had become, in the way of all constants, invisible through familiarity, perceived not as phenomenon but as background, the way you stop hearing the river after you've lived beside it long enough until the day the river stops. West Virginia achieved statehood in June 1863. The formality of it, the Congressional Act, the official boundaries, the new name on the maps, arrived in the Hollow via a newspaper that was already 2 weeks old when it got there. And the women read it and felt the complex thing that mountain people of ambivalent politics feel when their county becomes, without their having moved an inch, part of a different political entity. Some of them had wanted this, the separation from Virginia, the new state, the alignment with the Union, and felt it as a relief, a settling of an uncertainty. Some of them had not. The heartbeat, by which point they had been living with it for 22 months, did not acknowledge the change in sovereignty. The limestone beneath them did not reclassify itself. The underground river continued its cycle indifferent to whether its surface was Virginia or West Virginia, or the surface of the moon. Lieutenant Ira Buckley arrived in Harpers Hollow in July 1863. He came up the Hollow Road on a July afternoon when the heat sat heavy in the trees and the creek was low, and the hollow smelled of standing water and the particular mineral sharpness of sun-warmed limestone. He was traveling with a 2-man escort, a corporal and a private who had been assigned to accompany him in the field, and who were, by the time they reached Harpers Hollow, somewhat tired of accompanying a geologist anywhere. The geologist himself walked with a slight limp from an old injury to his left knee, which had the effect of giving his progress through the landscape a quality of careful deliberateness, as if he was choosing each step with more thought than most people give to walking. He had a leather satchel over one shoulder and a long canvas case over the other, and a notebook in his breast pocket, and he was looking at the ridges above the hollow with the particular attention of a man reading a text he has been waiting to read. Constance was in the garden when he came. She had been pulling weeds for an hour in the heat, and was not in a mood for visitors, especially visitors in uniform, whose presence in Greenbrier County had recently been associated more with requisition than with courtesy. But the lieutenant removed his hat when he spoke to her, which was a good sign, and he asked her, did not tell her, whether she might be able to provide him with information about the local geology and cave systems, for which he would pay in script and in coffee, if she had need of coffee, which she did. She straightened up from her garden and looked at him for a long moment, and decided he was telling the truth about what he wanted. He was 32 years old, this Lieutenant Ira Buckley, a compact man with brown hair cut close and wire-rimmed spectacles that he adjusted frequently as a nervous habit, with the hands of someone who worked with his hands but not in the way farmers work with theirs. His hands had calluses in different places from the grip of instruments and the pressure of pencils and the abrasion of limestone walls in tight cave passages. He had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a manufacturing man who had wanted him to study law, and he had studied law for 1 semester before switching to natural philosophy and then to geology under a professor named Hayes, who had taken him into a cave in Pennsylvania at the age of 19 and changed the direction of his life with no particular intention of doing so. Buckley had spent the subsequent 13 years in caves, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, a brief and eventful expedition to Kentucky, and had the flat certainty about underground geology that comes from having been proven right and wrong in equal measure by the evidence of rock, and replaced the theoretical confidence of his education with something more empirical and harder and more reliable. The Army had found him useful. Cave systems in the limestone territories were militarily significant. They provided saltpeter, the essential component of black powder, which the Confederacy had been mining from cave floors since the beginning of the war, and which the Union Army needed to know about. They provided shelter, water, storage. They provided, in some cases, passages that could function as tactical assets. Buckley had spent the previous year cataloging cave systems in the Shenandoah Valley and Western Virginia, assessing each for its saltpeter potential and its strategic value, and writing reports that someone in Washington presumably read. He was good at this work, and he did not find it tedious, which made him unusual among the military geologists who had been pressed into similar service. He had heard about the sound in Harpers Hollow 2 weeks before he arrived there from a county official in Lewisburg who had mentioned it as a local curiosity worth noting. He had written the detail in his notebook. Hollow residents report nightly subsurface vibration, rhythmic, 47-minute duration. Onset September 1860. Continuous, and underlined it and put a small asterisk beside it, and thought about it for 2 weeks before he arranged to visit the hollow as part of his cave survey of Greenbrier County. What struck him when Constance Harper described the sound to him on the evening of his first day in the hollow was the regularity. He asked her, before she had finished her description, whether the duration was consistent. She showed him Lemuel's ledger. He turned the pages carefully, reading the entries, the times, the durations, the ripple measurements, the weather notes, and his expression was the expression of a man finding something he had half expected and was nonetheless pleased to find. 47 minutes, he said, without exception. Without exception, Constance confirmed. In 3 years, he has recorded perhaps 2 nights where the onset was a few minutes later than midnight, never more than 5 minutes, never a night without the sound at all. And the duration? Always 47 minutes. He has timed it to the second some nights. The variance is less than a minute. Buckley set his notebook on the table and looked at her steadily. Mrs. Harper, that kind of regularity in a geological phenomenon means a mechanism. Natural processes are not usually so precise. Something down there is acting as a clock. I would very much like to stay for a few nights and hear it myself. He was given the front room on a pallet, and he stayed awake past midnight with his pocket watch in his hand and his notebook on his knee. The heartbeat began at 12 minutes past midnight by his watch, which was a high-quality instrument from a Philadelphia maker, and which he had reason to believe was accurate. He noted the onset, the character of the vibration. Infrasonic, he wrote, bimodal pulse, approximately 12 cycles per second at a guess, significantly below auditory threshold in frequency, but perceptible as chest vibration and pressure. And he timed it. 46 minutes and 58 seconds by the moment it ceased. He wrote for 20 minutes after it stopped, filling 2 pages of his notebook with first impressions. And then he lay back on his pallet and did not sleep for a long time, thinking. He was methodical in the way that good field scientists are methodical, which is not the methodicalness of a checklist, but the methodicalness of a person who has learned to let the phenomenon tell them what questions to ask. He spent the first 3 days simply observing, experiencing the sound each night, walking the hollow during the day, studying the surface geology with the particular kind of seeing that geology teaches, which is the ability to read the present landscape as the record of a long process. He identified the sinkholes, 4 of them, ranging from a small depression in the southwest corner of Arbogast's south field to a larger, more dramatic opening near the upper end of the hollow, where a section of ground had subsided 15 feet into an underlying void, and the walls of the subsidence were exposed limestone with visible solution channels. He noted the springs and the stream behavior. The way Harper's branch appeared fully formed from the limestone at the upper end of the hollow, the way it disappeared into the ground at the lower end, the springs that emerged partway down the hollow walls where secondary cave passages intersected the surface. He traced the invisible hydraulic story of the hollow by its surface evidence. As you read a paragraph by the words on the page, rather than by the paper they're printed on. He identified 5 cave openings accessible from the surface. 3 of them were the cold storage caves the families used, shallow rooms 10 to 30 feet deep, with ceilings high enough to stand in and floors worn smooth by decades of use, ending in passages too narrow for an adult. One was a natural opening low in the eastern ridge wall, partially hidden by a rhododendron thicket that dropped vertically about 20 feet into a small chamber before narrowing to impenetrability. The 5th was the most significant, a horizontal passage at creek level in the western ridge where water flowed out of the limestone during wet seasons and left a low, wide entrance that a man could enter on hands and knees, and that expanded, Buckley discovered on his 4th day, into a passable gallery about 4 feet high and 8 feet wide that ran northeast into the ridge for approximately 200 feet before reaching a sump, a section completely flooded with water that blocked further progress. He explored this gallery on his hands and knees with a lantern, taking measurements with his barometer and his compass, noting the formations on the walls, the rimstone dams, the helictites that grew in defiance of gravity, because in a sealed underground environment with no air movement, the crystal can grow in any direction it likes. The columns of flowstone where ceiling drip and floor buildup had met and fused over thousands of years. He was writing in his notebook as he went, and if the writing had more poetry in it than a military geological survey strictly required, this was not an accident. Buckley had, from his earliest time underground, felt the particular tug that caves exercise on people who are willing to be exercised. The sense of entering a realm that is older than anything above the surface, that has been conducting its own slow business for geological time, that contains beauty that no human eye had ever seen before his own, and that will continue to exist after the last human eye has closed. He was not sentimental about this, but he was not unmoved by it. The sump at the end of the gallery bothered him in a productive way. It meant the passage continued on the far side of the flooded section, and he could hear, when he lay flat at the edge of the water with his ear close to the surface, the sound of moving water beyond it, and occasionally, when the gallery was quiet around him, something that might have been the distant echo of the pulse. He began correlating his surface measurements with his underground observations. The pattern that emerged was coherent with what he had already hypothesized. The cave systems of Harpers Hollow were part of a larger underground drainage network running northeast-southwest, following the regional joint pattern in the limestone at a depth that varied from about 50 feet below surface at the ridge walls to something considerably deeper. His barometric estimates suggested 200 to 300 feet beneath the center of the hollow. The underground river that fed the hollow's springs and drained its surface water ran deep, well below the level he could reach through any accessible passage. He needed to understand the siphon. On his 6th day, he asked Constance whether he might spend an evening in the root cellar of the Harper house, the oldest cold storage cellar in the hollow, dug directly into the limestone floor of the hollow, with walls of dressed stone and a floor of bare rock. She said yes. He spent the evening of the 6th day lying on the floor of the root cellar from 10 in the evening until 2 in the morning, with his ear pressed against the bare limestone, with his instruments arranged around him in the cold dark, with his pocket watch in his hand, the cold storage smell of the cellar, turnips, preserved apples, the mineral cold of limestone, and the complete dark when he extinguished the lantern, and the sound of his own breathing and his own heartbeat. He noted, in his notebook, written by feel rather than sight, that the anticipation of the sound was itself interesting, that knowing it was coming, knowing its time and character, created a kind of expectant attention in him that he had not expected. He was not, as he had told himself he was, merely observing a mechanical phenomenon. He was waiting for something. It began at 12 minutes past midnight, as a sensation in his cheekbone where it pressed against the stone. Not sound, below hearing, a physical fact like temperature or texture, then in his chest, then, as he remained still and extended his attention deliberately, in the bones of his hands where they lay flat on the rock. He timed it, counted the pulses, noted the quality, bimodal, each cycle of 2 beats having a slight asymmetry, the first beat slightly more forceful, the second a kind of reverberation or echo of the first. Badoom. The badoom slightly softer, slightly elongated. He pressed his ear directly to the stone and heard, or felt, the barest harmonic structure, overtones in the low, audible range, present but very quiet. The phantom of a chord, he wrote, when it had ended, and he was lying in the dark root cellar of the Harper house, in the cold dark of a July night in 1863. His pocket watch ticking in his hand. I am lying at the bottom of a building, above one of the most remarkable natural instruments on the continent, and it has just played me its note, and I understand it no better than the women who've been listening to it for 3 years, and I believe I understand it entirely. The siphon theory took form over the next week of observations and measurements and calculations. He had seen siphon caves before. They were common in mature karst systems, wherever the local water table fluctuated seasonally, and the mechanics of them were well understood by cave geologists of his acquaintance. A hydraulic siphon in a cave occurs when a passage dips below the water table for a section. The passage fills with water, sealing it airtight on both sides, and the water must be pushed through under pressure. When the pressure builds sufficiently, the water discharges in a surge through the lowest point of the siphon. The surges are rhythmic when the water supply is roughly constant. Fill, surge, drain, fill, surge, drain. The period of the cycle, the fill time, depends on the volume of the siphon and the rate of water supply. Different siphons have different periods. Some cycle in minutes, some in hours. A 47-minute siphon was large. Very large. The fill volume of the siphon passage would be substantial to require 47 minutes at the flow rates typical of an underground river in this part of Virginia. Buckley estimated, working backward from the cycle time and the estimated flow rates of similar systems, that the siphon passage was perhaps 300 feet long and 10 to 20 feet in diameter for much of its length. A significant cave passage, sealed by the local water table, filling and discharging in its own geological rhythm, without any reference to the world above it. The chamber that amplified the signal was the key insight. He had been thinking about it since his night in the root cellar, about the quality of the sound, not just the infrasonic pulse, but the way it seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, as if the limestone itself were the source, rather than any particular point below. This was not acoustically consistent with a single-point vibration source. It was consistent with a large, resonant chamber acting as a distributed source, radiating sound in all directions from a structure that was already vibrating as a whole. He thought about the guitar body, how the strings transfer their vibration to the top of the instrument, and the top transfers it to the air inside, and the shape and size and material of the body determine which frequencies are amplified. A cave chamber with the right dimensions would do the same thing. Certain frequencies would resonate within it, would build and sustain, while others would die out. If the chamber's resonant frequency matched the fundamental frequency of the siphon discharge, if the hydraulic pulse was occurring at exactly the right timing to energize the chamber's natural resonance, the result would be exactly what was rising through the limestone of Harpers Hollow every night. He spent 2 days checking his arithmetic. The resonant frequency of a cave chamber depends on its dimensions, length, width, height, in the same mathematical relationship that governs the resonance of any acoustic cavity. He estimated the chamber dimensions from the surface evidence and from his barometric depth calculations, and from what he could see of the passage geometry at the known cave entrances. The numbers were rough, but they were consistent. He wrote up his findings in his field journal in careful, measured language, and then he read back what he had written and decided that the careful, measured language was insufficient to the situation. He crossed it out and wrote it again, this time the way a man writes when he is trying to be both accurate and honest about the limits of accuracy. Day 11. I have a coherent mechanical explanation for the phenomenon of Harpers Hollow. An underground river, approximately 300 feet below the surface, flows through a siphon passage of considerable size. The siphon cycles, fills and discharges, with a period of 47 minutes. The discharge pulse transmits as a compressional wave upward through the limestone. A large cave chamber acts as a resonator, amplifying the infrasonic component of the pulse to the level where it is perceptible at the surface. The resonance was apparently triggered by a rock fall in the upstream passage sometime in late August 1860, which altered the flow geometry of the siphon and created the resonance conditions that had not previously existed. He paused here and then wrote below this, as a separate paragraph. I note that this explanation is complete as a mechanical account. It describes the physical process with sufficient accuracy for any practical purpose. I note further that it does not explain why the rockfall occurred in August 1860, which is a question of the same difficulty as asking why any particular thing happens at any particular moment. The answer being, because all the necessary conditions had accumulated, and the last necessary condition arrived when it arrived, and the event occurred. I have no explanation to offer for why August 1860. I note only that it was August 1860, and that it was, therefore, exactly the moment when an unusual and constant and meaningful seeming signal would find the most attentive and most anxious audience possible. He showed this passage to Constance Harper when he had written it. She read it at the kitchen table, her hands still floury from the morning's bread, and she read it twice before she looked up. "You're saying it's coincidence," she said. "I'm saying the mechanism is mechanical," he said carefully. "I'm saying a rock fell, and the geometry changed, and the sound began. Those facts don't require coincidence or intention. But you noted it," she said. "August 1860. You noted that it was exactly the moment." He was quiet for a moment. "I noted it," he said. She turned back to the page. Then she said, "What does a mechanism explain when you've explained it? Does the bell mean nothing because you know it's made of bronze?" He didn't have an answer to this. He thought about it for the rest of his time in the hollow, and the answer he didn't find would trouble him for years. His final field journal entry from Harpers Hollow, which he later transcribed into the formal report he submitted to his commanding officer, read as follows: "The citizens of Harpers Hollow are living above one of the most remarkable natural instruments on the continent. The earth beneath them is quite literally playing a note. It is not a message. It is physics. But I understand why they hear a heartbeat. Humans hear what they need to hear." He spent his last evening in the hollow, sitting on the Harpers' porch with Constance, who had shown him her 3 years of diary entries, and who had answered every question he had asked with a precision and an honesty that he found in a field that was often full of imprecise and self-serving reporting from civilians, unusual and admirable. She asked him whether he thought it would continue, and he said he thought it would continue until something changed in the upstream geometry, another rockfall, a change in the regional water table, some other perturbation, and that such changes were common in active cave systems and could happen at any time or not for centuries. She asked him whether she would hear it in advance, whether there would be any warning that it was going to stop. He said probably not. Cave systems worked in their own time and on their own schedule, and did not give notice. Like most things, she said. He left the next morning before the family was fully awake, leaving a letter of thanks on the kitchen table and a report of his geological findings written out in full, which Constance would keep for the rest of her life, and which would eventually find its way to the Greenbrier Historical Society along with her diary. Granny Skaggs, who had listened to Buckley's explanation from a chair on her porch 2 days before he left, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the ridge above the hollow, had said when he finished, "I know what a siphon is. My husband worked in a mill for 20 years. Water and pipes, I understand." She paused. "You're saying it's the caves settling?" "In a manner of speaking. That's what I've been saying for 3 years." She looked at him steadily. "Does your explanation say the settling is finished or not finished?" He considered this carefully. "Not finished," he said. in a limestone karst system of this age and complexity. Significant change is always ongoing. On a geological timescale, everything happening in these caves is happening very recently. Then my advice is the same as it has always been, she said. Pay attention. Be ready to move if the ground tells you to move. She unfolded her hands and stood from her chair with the deliberate economy of a very old woman who does not waste motion. The explanation is interesting, she said. It doesn't change what's underneath us. This was, Buckley later wrote to a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, the most concise summary of the limits of geological explanation he had ever encountered. He quoted it in a paper he wrote in 1867 about cave acoustics without attribution, because he had not thought to ask her name. The autumn of 1864 came in cold, earlier than usual, with frost in the second week of September, and the trees turning by the end of the month with the particular urgency of a season that knows it has less time than it expected. The war was changing shape. Grant was grinding at Lee in the trenches around Petersburg. Sherman was in Georgia turning the Confederacy's geography against it. The political fact of the thing was becoming clearer to everyone who was paying attention, though the physical fact of the dying continued with the same indifference to political clarity that it had shown for 3 years. Calvin Harper had survived this long. The letters home were irregular, but they came, and the last one Constance had received was dated August and said he was in good health and tired, and that the mountains of Virginia from the east looked different than the mountains of West Virginia from the west, flatter and more wooded, and without the distinctive limestone ridges, and that he thought about the hollow sometimes when he was having trouble sleeping. She had read this letter a great many times. On a night in late November 1864, Constance Harper woke at midnight. This was not unusual. Her body had been waking at midnight for 4 years, the habit established in the first weeks of the heartbeat, and never quite lost even after she learned to sleep through it, so that some sleeping part of her brain had apparently adopted midnight as a checkpoint, a moment of brief surfacing from sleep to confirm that the world was in its expected configuration. The expected configuration, for 4 years, had been the vibration in the floor, the low pressure of the pulse in the chest, the ba-dum rhythm moving through the house from below. She woke. She registered the heartbeat. She returned to sleep. On this night in late November, she woke, and there was nothing. She lay still for a long moment, not entirely certain she was fully awake. The dark was complete. No moon, thick cloud cover, the particular black of a late November night in the mountains. She could hear the wind in the oaks on the ridge, and the distant sound of Harper's branch low in its banks, and the slow breathing of Lemuel beside her. She could hear all the ordinary sounds of the night. She could not feel the heartbeat. She counted. She counted 60 seconds, which is not as long as you would think when you are lying in the dark waiting for something. Nothing. She counted 60 more. Nothing. She pressed her palm flat against the floor beside the bed, cold wood, rough grain, completely still. She stayed there with her palm on the floor for 5 full minutes, by her best reckoning. The floor did not vibrate. The earth beneath the floor was silent. She got up. She went to the door and opened it into the November cold and stood in the doorway looking out across the hollow. The night was very dark, but she could see, across the darkness, that a light had appeared in the Skaggs' house. While she watched, Another appeared further down the hollow, at the Whitings. Then another. Then, close by, the small, warm square of the lamp in the front room of what had been the Arbogast house, occupied now by a cousin's family, Arbogast himself having removed to Louisburg in the previous year. The lights appeared one by one, irregular, the sequence of people waking up and reaching for matches, and Constance understood that she was watching the whole community wake up for the same reason she had woken up. Because nothing was happening. This was the peculiarity of it. The thing that she would try to explain in her diary and find difficult to capture in words, though she tried more than once. The community had been woken by the absence of something. The non-event had startled them out of sleep as thoroughly as any event could have. The silence at midnight was louder, in its way, than the sound had ever been, because the sound had become so thoroughly expected, so deeply embedded in the body's sense of normality, that its withdrawal registered as an alarm, a wrongness, an emergency that the sleeping brain could not ignore. She wrote in her diary the next morning, "The mountain has stopped breathing." That was the first thought I had when I understood the sound was gone. Not, the mechanism has ceased. Not, the siphon has changed. The mountain has stopped breathing. And I was not afraid. I was bereft. The community gathered in the churchyard in the cold morning light, as they had gathered in the September warmth 4 years before, wearing their coats this time, their breath visible in the air. They were older. There were faces missing, some gone to war, some dead of ordinary causes, some simply moved away in the disruption of the previous years. The children who had been small in 1860 were children still, but older, and they stood in the gathered group with the serious faces of young people who understand that adults are upset about something, even when they don't understand exactly what. The talk had two qualities: the ordinary practical quality of people checking their experience against each other. Did you feel it? No. Did you? No. Nothing. All night. And underneath that, the less practical, less easily articulable quality of people trying to understand what they felt about an absence that they had not known. Until the absence arrived, they would feel anything about at all. They had not loved the heartbeat. Most of them would have said, on any given night in the previous 4 years, that they could do without it, that they would be glad to sleep uninterrupted at midnight, that the sound was at best a curiosity, and at worst a nuisance. And now it was gone, and the nuisance turned out to have been a kind of comfort, and the absence of it was a grief that they were embarrassed to articulate, because it seemed unreasonable to grieve for a sound in the ground that you had never asked for and had spent 4 years making peace with. Those in the community who had interpreted the heartbeat as divine communication. The handful who had followed Reverend Whiting's original reading, the ones who had maintained the theological interpretation even after Whiting himself had quietly abandoned it, felt something like vindication, and then immediately something like loss. The war was ending. Everyone knew the war was ending. Sherman's march, the fall of Atlanta, Lincoln's re-election, the grinding siege at Petersburg. All of it was pointing in one direction. The heartbeat had started when the nation's crisis started, and it had ended when the crisis was ending. They said this to each other in the churchyard in low voices, with the particular tone of people who are right and who do not entirely wish to be right, because being right about the war's meaning includes being right about its cost. Mrs. Skaggs, Granny Skaggs, who was 77 years old now and moved more slowly than she had in 1860, but whose eyes and mind had lost nothing, said what she had been saying for 4 years. The caves shifted. They shifted at the beginning, and now they have shifted again. What is down there has changed its pattern. This is what caves do. She said it without any quality of triumph or of consolation. She said it the way you say a plain fact when you have been saying it long enough that the saying of it is simply a habit of accuracy. And then she said something she had not said before, in a quieter voice, to Constance specifically, standing apart from the larger group in the frosted churchyard. I want you to know that I think you will be all right here. I have been saying move for 4 years, but I have been saying it because the ground is active, and active ground can be dangerous, and it can also simply be active. What is beneath us has been speaking and has stopped speaking, and I no longer know what that means for whether we should stay or go. I am too old to move, in any event, but I want you to know that I have listened to this ground for 77 years, and what I hear in it now is not danger. It sounds like settling, not collapse. Settling. Constance wrote this conversation down verbatim when she got home. It was the most specific thing Granny Skaggs had said about the sound in 4 years, and it was the thing that made Constance feel, for the first time since midnight, something that was not grief. Lemuel took it practically, as Lemuel took almost everything. He noted in his ledger, November 1864. The sound has ceased. Last recorded onset was the night of the 21st. First night of absence was the 22nd. He would continue to note the absence every night for 3 more months, in case it returned, and then stop. Not because he had given up hope of its return, but because the absence had become as normal as the presence had been, and he was a man who recorded phenomena, not their lack. She wrote to Buckley in December. His letter arrived in January 1865, carried by a postwriter in the last difficult weeks of a war that was clearly ending, but had not yet bothered to admit it. She read it at the kitchen table on a cold afternoon with Lemuel across from her, and she read the relevant section aloud. I have explained the mechanism. I cannot explain the timing. September 1860 to November 1864, the exact duration of the American crisis. I am a scientist, and I do not believe in providence, but I note the correlation, and I leave it without comment. She set the letter down. Lemuel was looking at the table. September 1860. He said, 4 years and 2 months, she said, almost to the day. They were both quiet. Then Lemuel said, He's right not to claim more than the correlation. A man of science should be careful. He's also right that the correlation is there, Constance said, whether it means anything or not. I don't know whether it means anything. Neither does he. Neither does anyone, Lemuel said, and this seemed to settle something, or at least to put it in a place where it could be held without requiring resolution. Spring came. Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April, and the news came to the Hollow the way all the news had come for 4 years, slowly, carried by humans, already a week old when it arrived, and received with a complex feeling that the end of a long and terrible thing always produces relief and grief and the particular tiredness of people who have been sustaining their courage for years and are now being told they can put it down. Several families in the Hollow had lost men. One of the Skaggs boys, the youngest Whiting's son. Two men from the larger farms whose names Constance recorded in her diary with careful attention, because names are how you keep people from becoming statistics. Calvin Harper came home in June 1865, walking up the Hollow Road on a Tuesday afternoon in a uniform that had seen the last month of the war and was showing it. He was 22 years old, and he was not the boy who had lain on the ground, pressing his palms flat, and said, "The mountain feels alive." He was not yet the man he would be in 10 or 20 years. He was the thing in between, someone who had seen enough to know that the world was larger and more terrible than anything he had known, and who was not sure yet how to be in the world he had come back to. He found his mother on the porch, as she had been, more days than not, when she was not working. He sat down beside her. The Hollow was very quiet. The afternoon sounds of the creek and the birds and the wind in the trees. No sound from below. "Is it still doing it?" he said. "No," she said. "It stopped in November." He absorbed this. He had thought about the heartbeat for 3 years, lying in camp at night or on marches when his mind needed something other than what was immediately around him. He had described it to other soldiers who had never heard anything like it, and they had been skeptical, and he had not tried to persuade them. He had carried it with him as a private fact about home, a specific and peculiar fact that was his alone among the men he served with, and the sound of it in his memory was as precise as it had been the last night he'd sat on this porch. "November," he said, "the 22nd. The war was ending then." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you think there's something in that?" She thought about Buckley's letter. She thought about what she had written in her own diary in the weeks after the silence began, working through what she thought about coincidence and meaning, and the difference between correlation and intention. She had not resolved it. She did not think it was resolvable, which was not the same as thinking it was unimportant. "I think there's something in everything," she said. "The question is, what kind of something?" He nodded. This seemed to be enough. They sat together on the porch until the evening came on, and the Hollow filled with the ordinary sounds of a June twilight, and neither of them said anything more about the heartbeat, though both of them were listening, in the way you always listen after something has been there and gone. The Hollow went on. Communities go on in the mountain way, which is not the triumphant going on of people who have overcome something, but the determined going on of people who have outlasted something and are not sure exactly what to do with the fact of their own survival. The Arbogast family had gone for good. The Cousins family that had occupied the big house for the last year of the war left in the autumn of 1865 for reasons that were not explained and were understood. The Whiting stayed. Reverend Whiting continued to preach, his sermons smaller and more personal than they had been in the years when he had been reading national history into geological phenomena, and perhaps better for the smallness. Granny Skaggs outlived 2 of the children she had delivered, and most of the predictions she had made about the Hollow's geological instability, proving immediately dangerous, which she took with equanimity. She had said the caves were active, and they were active. And the fact that the activity had been mostly acoustic rather than structural was something she was glad of, not something she had been wrong about. Constance kept her diary. She would keep it for another 30 years, and it would become, in the hands of her grandchildren, and then in the holdings of the Greenbrier Historical Society, a document of unusual richness and specificity about life in a mountain hollow through the most consequential decade in American history. The entries about the heartbeat, which began in September 1860 and ended in November 1864, with a few subsequent entries about the silence, were eventually recognized as the most detailed civilian record of the phenomenon that existed. When geologists came to the county in later decades, they were shown the diary, and they read it with the respectful attention of scientists reading accurate field notes from a careful observer who happened not to have had scientific training. The underground river went on, as underground rivers do, conducting its dark work through the limestone of the Allegheny Mountains without reference to the events above. The siphon passage continued to fill and drain, but the resonance conditions that had produced the heartbeat were gone, altered by the same geological restlessness that had created them. The cave system's slow self-modification through rockfall and dissolution and sediment movement, and the endless pressure of water finding its way through the path of least resistance. The chamber that had acted as a resonator for 47 months remained, and its acoustic properties remained, but the signal that had energized those properties was no longer arriving at the right frequency and the right timing, and so the chamber was quiet. Not dead. The water still moved through it. The formations still grew by the imperceptible increments of geological time. The river still ran, but silent. Harpers Hollow still exists. The cave system beneath it was partially mapped in 1975 by the West Virginia Speleological Society. They confirmed the siphon chamber, the underground river, and the acoustic properties Buckley described. They did not detect the heartbeat. The resonance conditions had not recurred since 1864. But they noted that the chamber's acoustics are extraordinary. A whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other, 400 feet away. The mountain, even in silence, is listening. Constance Harper's diary is held by the Greenbrier Historical Society. Her final entry about the heartbeat, dated November 1864, reads, "The sound has gone. I did not love it. I did not understand it. But I knew it was there, every night, beneath us. And now it is not, and the world feels less real without it. I think that is what it means to live on a mountain. You share the mountain's life, its sounds, its rhythms, and when those change, you change too. The mountain does not care about us, but we cannot help caring about the mountain.